Have you ever had a difficulty feeding your baby that took a while to find the root cause? Or even if you knew the root cause, did it take a lot of time to get to a place where you felt like you had overcome whatever difficulty you were facing? My guest today shares 2 baby feeding stories. She encountered difficulties with both of her babies, but her story is such a great example of how much we have to educate ourselves and how hard we have to work to get the support needed to feel really good about our baby feeding situations. So get ready to hear these incredible stories right after this ad from my sponsor, Feast and Fettle.
When I first returned to work, I had no idea how I was going to manage going to work, handling drop-offs and pickups, and doing all the other duties I needed to do, like get dinner on the table. If you are in this situation, I've got a solution for you. Go to feastandfettle.com, where you can select from a menu of delicious options and have home-cooked meals delivered right to your front door. Imagine taking meal planning off your plate, taking grocery shopping off your plate for those dinners, and knowing that all you have to do is pick up your baby, get home, and heat and serve meals that you have selected for your family. If you live in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and now Maine, go to feastandfettle.com and use my code MILK, M-I-L-K, to get $30 off your first order. You've got nothing to lose.
Hi, Rachel. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Do you want to take a minute to introduce yourself and your family before we hear your story?
Sure. My name is Rachel, and I am a mom to 2 kids. I have a 4-year-old daughter and an 11-month-old son. He'll be 1 next week, actually. And I'm also a psychiatrist. So, and just a disclaimer that I'm just going to be talking about my personal experience and nothing of medical advice.
Yes, even advice that I give as an IBCLC, it is not meant to be medical advice on the podcast. Take me back to upbringing in your childhood and tell me about any exposure you had to baby feeding and your memories that you have of types of baby feeding that you saw.
So, not much, honestly. Very little. I did some babysitting in high school for actual babies, but I wasn't involved in the feeding of the babies. And then I am the oldest. My sister is 5 years younger than, and apparently we were both breastfed for at least a year, but I don't have any memory of her being fed or my mom feeding her. So that's my experience in childhood. And then in medical school, I also didn't have a ton of exposure, just learned that the recommendation is to exclusively breastfeed for 6 months. Didn't get a lot of exposure to breastfeeding mothers during that time or people. But then in my residency, I had pretty good training in perinatal mental health, including around like supporting people in the nuances of making treatment decisions, and oftentimes there's considerations for feeding. But I would say the biggest personal exposure for me was 6 months before my daughter was born. A close friend had her first child, and she breastfed very openly, shared her experience with highs and lows, and she was a real role model, inspiration for me throughout that particularly first breastfeeding experience.
Yeah, I think many of us have that person that we can name that helped us feel like maybe it would be possible for us, because you hear so much about how difficult breastfeeding is and can be. So it's nice to have role models that help us know that, hey, there are people who do this successfully.
Yes, and just right there for support and really normalizing so many things.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you make of not having seen breastfeeding as a child during your adolescence?
I think that when it then came to my opportunity to breastfeed, it was really mysterious at first and a real mountain to climb.
It's really an interesting phenomenon that I do think contributes to the difficulty we have today.
Yeah, it makes sense.
S Yeah. So you had that person who was a close friend. Did you, feel like you needed to prepare or learn about breastfeeding in any way when you were pregnant?
I I didn't feel like she was reading this book, some book about breastfeeding. I don't exactly remember it. She's like, "You can read it if you want." And I remember looking at it and just thinking, I just can't take this in right now while I'm pregnant. It doesn't, I can't. And part of that was I took a childbirth education class and they did a couple lessons on breastfeeding and okay, all right. But it was just really hard to take in the theory, I think, before like getting on the breast bike, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's something I hear a lot, that people feel totally unprepared, yet it doesn't seem like they can think of a great way to have felt more prepared because it's hard to know until you're there.
Yeah, at least that first time anyways, and doulas at the time had some recommendations in terms of, "Oh, you can get these teas," or, can't remember what else, like, little recommendations, and I got the teas. I tried to express some colostrum. Somebody, I think it was another, yeah, it was a lactation consultant I had spoke to briefly because my daughter was a planned cesarean, and in making preparations for that, I had I did reach out to a lactation consultant who was also a doula, primarily, I think, because we wanted more support in the home. And she said, "See if you can express some colostrum." And I was like, "Okay." Didn't know even how to do so and did not get any colostrum.
So then tell me a little bit about, you can just go into what you think is important when it comes to your feeding experiences, and I'll jump in and ask questions as needed.
Okay. I'll start talking about my first breastfeeding experience with my daughter. Like I was saying, she was a planned cesarean because she was breech despite everything I tried to turn her. She was breech, and so she
Mm,
came by surgical birth. And I had great postpartum support in the hospital. They supported me in getting her to latch, supported in a little bit of pumping to get my milk supply going. And then we went home and went to the pediatricians for 3 day or 5 day weight check. And she had lost more than 10% of her birth weight. So at that point, we were put on a triple feeding plan about once a day where we were doing this and I would feed her,
okay.
I would pump. Then actually my partner did like a finger feeding. He would tape this little tube to his finger and she would try to suck a little bit of the extra milk that I had pumped. And we did that, yeah, for around a week or two. And her weight was starting to come up. But also in that whole time, like the first week, my nipples were all bloody and sore. And that was really
Mm,
uncomfortable. One of the lactation consultants we saw and mentioned, oh, maybe she has a posterior tie. Maybe she's having trouble in part with latching, and that's what's going on. Um, and we ended up going to see an ENT for a consult about whether to release we really were hesitant and didn't know really what to do. And then, unfortunately, she got this really scary infection called onpholitis, and was pretty quickly admitted to the hospital when she was 2 weeks old, which
mm,
was a truly scary and terrible experience. And while we were there, interestingly, it was like the act of breastfeeding clicked for the two of us, like the dance for
mm,
us. And in part, I think like she was hooked up to IV antibiotics, and I honestly, I was nervous that she was going to make it, but I felt like I had breast milk to give her. I could give her breast milk, and so feeding her was, like, incredibly comforting for me and
Mm.
maybe for her. I just tried to send her healing thoughts and whatever was coming through my breast milk, and we forgot about the tongue tie, and she w turned a corner. She did fine. She healed from the infection, went home about 10 days later, and feeding was going well. There were no more concerns about her weight. And then I opened one of her diapers up, and it was like a confetti popper of blood, just blood. You could see it. I was quite alarmed, especially she had just been on 2 different IV antibiotics. I thought, "Oh, what is" so we went to the
Mhm.
pediatrician, and, they actually diagnosed her with cow's milk protein allergy,
Mm.
and at that point recommended I eliminate all dairy from my diet, soy as well, because I was told that oftentimes cross reacts with the dairy protein. And at first, this was a difficult diet for me to get accustomed to. I didn't totally understand, like, it meant no dairy, even, like, butter baked in a biscuit or something like that.
Mm.
But I was able to eliminate it, and with that, the blood in her stool did resolve. Thankfully, she didn't have any weight gain problems throughout that process. And after that, we had a pretty smooth breastfeeding experience. The only thing I would say is it was definitely this I really felt this pressure to be her clean source of food, to make sure I could keep breastfeeding her because of this GI issue. There was a period early on in there when I was eliminating the dairy where I think our pediatrician had recommended, oh, you could try an alimentum formula or something that's dairy free. Maybe it would help while your system is cleaning out, if you will. And she hated it and it smelled terrible. So always in the back of my mind, I was like, well, formula is not feeling like it'll be an alternative. So we kept going, but it was also really I enjoyed it, and we hit 6 months, which had been my initial goal to make it to. I think because of what I learned in medical school. But I certainly was not ready to stop feeding, and again, this was help from my friend. She was still feeding, and she's like, "Yeah, just keep we're still going. If you're going, keep going." So we kept
Mhm.
going till she was about 2 years old and had just feed started to drop here and there, and I think at the end of mutually, we were both ready to be done.
Yeah. When you had planned to go for at least 6 months was your goal. Did you have an understanding at that time that if you had stopped breastfeeding, she would need to transition to some other form of milk as her primary nutritional source?
I didn't when I initially made that goal prenatally or in the first
Yeah.
weeks, I didn't think about that, but then when I was in it,
Okay.
yes, I certainly
Okay.
knew that and didn't want
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot yeah, and I think every person is entitled to set their own goals. I think often when people are setting goals that are less than a year, but sometimes even beyond a year, they don't always understand that if you're going to end before a year, totally fine, sometimes beyond a year, depending on how developmentally ready your child is for solids, that it's not just a transition to solid food, that some sort of milk, whether it's formula or human milk, is the primary nutritional source still for quite some time after that 6-month mark.
yeah, and I'd say I'm also grateful we were able it worked out for us. If 6
Yes,
months had
yes.
been we would have had to make arrangements, and that would have been okay too.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with something like cow's milk protein allergy, sometimes for some people that's like, "Okay, I've had enough. I'm ready to go back to eating what I love to eat," because you can find those ingredients in everything,
Yeah.
granola bars and
Tortilla chips, we got a surprise. Also, our pediatrician would
oh my
say
gosh.
incrementally, you can try again at 9 months and introduce some dairy into your diet, see how
Uh-huh.
it goes. And I think it was, yeah, she was 9 months old. I was like, "Why is there blood in your stool?" "I haven't had any dairy." So we'd call it getting hidden dairy. And that time, I remember I turned over the tortilla chips, and I'm like, "Oh, how bizarre. There's dairy in these."
Weird. Yeah. I've heard a lot of people who have had to eliminate dairy talk about, and soy, talk about how it's just in everything. It's hard to eat a lot of packaged foods if you are having to eliminate dairy and soy.
I can say it is a there are so many other options, I think, than many years ago there used to be, so oftentimes I don't
Right.
feel deprived or have learned to
Mhm.
make alternative dishes or what I can substitute. But it also sometimes is not affordable, and I think about that for when people are faced with this decision. It can be expensive. The formula, the
Yeah.
non-dairy formula is expensive, the diet can be expensive.
And if you have supplemental income or help from WIC or something, sometimes it actually is the cheaper choice to move
Mm,
on to another
yeah,
type of formula that you get help for,
I could see that.
because they're not going to increase your SNAP benefits just because you need different types of food. So you mentioned that you were able to, every once in a while, try to reintroduce dairy. Were you ever able to, or is she still dairy free?
She took a really long time to grow out of it, but she did grow
Mhm.
out of it around 3 years old. While I was breastfeeding her, I
Mhm.
wasn't able to introduce it back in, and we tried some in her diet when she was doing solids early on, but it really wasn't until
Mhm.
here recently that she's been able to tolerate
Mm.
dairy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Anything else about her
I
story?
will add this because I think it's relevant to the story with my son, is that in feeding her, I had a couple of clogged ducts, which I was
Mm.
able one of those I was able to resolve on my own. The other one did turn into mastitis, and it was a very uncomfortable experience. This is when she was about 4 months old, unpleasant, and I needed antibiotics that time. And this wonderful lactation consultant actually came to my house during that period, and at that time, she was really helping me learn how to hand express, and the recommendation from her was really hands-on in that period, try to get the clog out. So there was a lot of
Mm.
manipulation of that breast that was inflamed.
Mm. Yeah, and what happened after you were doing that really hands-on work to try to
I don't know, I I just remember us being up in my room and her helping me hand express into this metal bowl, and I felt like a cow, and I don't remember anything dramatically releasing. Just remember
Mhm.
my breast was very red and hot, and the next morning I woke up and the other one had turned into the same thing,
Mm.
and was some of the sickest I had felt in a really long time. And luckily, in that breastfeeding experience, it never happened again, but it certainly left a mark in my memory as something I would not like to experience again.
Yeah, yeah. It can be surprising how painful
Yeah,
mastitis
yeah,
is.
the sudden chills and flu and or fluish feelings,
Right.
fever.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, thanks for sharing that because I know it is relevant. Before we move on, I would like to ask if you're okay with talking about it a little bit, having that experience in the hospital with a very sick infant who had an infection. It was omphalitis, you said?
Yeah, so that's an infection of the belly button area, the umbilicus, which actually so the pediatrician had told me, "Wow, that's the second case I've seen in 17 years, and it's so scary because there's still an open vessel, and if the infection moves into that vessel, it can become systemic and deadly."
Yes, that's incredibly scary. Is there any do you know if there's any data demonstrating the outcomes for babies who have had colostrum versus babies who have not had colostrum? Because I know colostrum has that effect of at least sealing the gut, so it's not permeable, and I'm just wondering if that can make an impact for these babies or if you've seen anything like that.
I don't know. I didn't think about that, and I didn't hear anything or look at that, but
Mm.
it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I'll have to look into it and see. I'm so glad that despite it being so hard and her being in the hospital, that at least you had the comfort of being able to feed her from your body.
Me too. It was a
Uh,
real blessing.
yeah, and did you get support for that while you were there, or did you feel like you were needing to fight a little bit to be able to do that?
They were supportive. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm, that's great. Well, I am so glad that she recovered, and I'm sure that sticks with you. Those sorts of experiences don't go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So then as you were thinking about adding to your family or as you became pregnant,
Mhm.
did you think any differently about breastfeeding for the second time around than you did for the first?
Well, I was, um, both excited and nervous, but my general memories of it with my daughter were a very positive experience and something I wanted to do again. And at this point, I was hoping it would be a similar length of time as well, of approximately 2 years or so.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. So you had changed like what you thought was the amount of time you would feed. So tell me how it went in the beginning.
So he was born via VBAC, and it was a wonderful birth experience. Although I did hemorrhage, and so my memory is spotty of his first latch, but I was actually just looking back at a picture that my partner had taken, and it looks like actually he had a beautiful first latch. I do remember we had support of a midwife who, in those first few moments, put her finger in his mouth and was like, there might be a little posterior tie. We'll watch it. And then we went into the recovery room, or our recovery area room. Yeah. And the nursing was very hands off. So it was just us, and it was nice. We were basically just left alone. And it was the week. That first 24 hours was a Saturday. Pediatrician came by really late. Nobody offered a lactation consult. And I thought, okay, I think things are going okay. And then the next day, nurse came in, was about to discharge us, had her fingers on the keyboard, was like, do you want a lactation consult, by the way? I was like, I guess we're doing okay. And she glanced at us. She's like, yeah, latch looks okay. And you're a second time mom, right? I was
Hmm.
thinking, yeah, but in the back of my mind, I was feeling like, yes, and I can remember some things and want that consult.
Mhm.
It's also the winter time, the snow's starting to fall. We had a kind of difficult drive ahead of us, so I declined the consult. We discharged. We went home, and he was feeding good. Really, my memories, he was quite ravenous, just feeding a lot and taking big clusters, feeding just kind of hours on end those first few days, and gaining great weight. We did have wonderfully a midwife who was able to come visit us in our home that first week, and she said that weight gain looked wonderful. Um, but I noticed it was about after the first week where he started to just take one side at a time and feed really quite frequently. So he'd take one side, and from very early on, it was really challenging to tell when he was hungry, when he was satiated. For example, his fists were just always clenched, whether he was hungry, whether he was, I think, after he was satiated. Um, and he was popping on and off my breast a lot. My nipples were bleeding again. And I was
Mm.
noticing the latch didn't feel painful, but he was sliding to the tip of my nipple and it felt kind of pinchy. And he was spitting up a lot and he seemed really, this bothered him. And then there was also this, he always sounded congested. He sounded like he had a cold. My sister said, oh, he sounds like a little piggy.
Mm.
But again, he gets more weigh-ins, he's gaining weight okay. I brought up the pinchy feeling latch and it wasn't painful. And so providers were like, I mean, probably okay. So the other thing I was noticing was that my breasts just never felt empty. They were just really seemingly engorged all the time. And he's feeding like just it felt like all the time too, 12 to 14 plus times a day. Then right at the end of 2 weeks, he we chose to have him circumcised and he was circumcised. And shortly after that, he didn't feed quite as well and I got my first clogged duct, which included some progressed to some red streaking. It was also in the middle, this is winter, of a terrible ice storm. It was hard for providers to see me. I think I had a video consult with my midwife, and she provided me with some ideas and support. But I was, it was a little alarming to me. And I think I had that memory of my daughter and that mastitis, and I was just hoping, oh, I don't want this to progress. And that one was able to resolve it. Although at that point, somebody had recommended using ice, but I don't think my midwife had, and I felt hesitant to use the ice. So I didn't use ice, but mainly used heat. And then 2 weeks later, I got another clog. And at that point, the lactation consultant I was seeing recommended that I try block feeding. So feeding off of one breast for an even longer period of time because he wouldn't take like multiple hours in between. So it'd be like feed off one breast for 3 or 4 hours. And I tried this for a few days and then I got another clog. So I wasn't feeling very excited about block feeding or these attempts to decrease my supply. And so moving to around when he's 1 month old, he just was becoming increasingly fussy generally, but really with feeding too. He still just wasn't content at the breast, and it was really hard to get him to feed and latch. I would try to feed him in the living room near my family, near my daughter. I'd had these dreams like I'll feed the baby and I'll read a book to my daughter, and he couldn't latch. He was distracted. I had to go up and feed him in a room by myself, and even then it was still this kind of, unfortunately, I hate using this word, but it kind of felt like this battle. And I was noticing during this time, like I was holding my breath to even like hoping, okay, latch and feed, and also please help relieve some of this pressure that's in my breast. And we were trying all kinds of positions, laid back, side lying, all of these, and they weren't working. Cradle seemed to be the position he could feed in and worked for us. And also around this time, he started having mucousy poops, no blood. In the back of my mind, I was wondering, is there food playing into this? Although I was still primarily not really eating dairy and soy, so it wasn't my primary concern. And then 6 weeks hit, and it was next level of fussiness, hours of crying during the day, more at night, but during the day too. His face was red, his fists were just clenched, and he would shake them. This would happen at the breast. It was not really peaceful feeding times. And it was kind of sad for me because he never was seeming soothed at my breast. We went to the pediatrician around this time, and she was holding him and was hearing him reflux and prescribed him a reflux med at that time. I was hesitant to give it to him though, so I think we gave him like one dose and that was it. I started reading more about the tongue tie and considering that, and mainly I started reading more of the potential links with reflux, and that's what got me to really think about, let's maybe see about getting it released. So luckily, at 8 weeks, we were able to get in with an ENT who did release his tongue and his lip. And there weren't any immediate changes. His latch didn't like suddenly magically improve, but slowly his latch got better. And maybe mm, there was improvement in his congestion and reflux. It didn't go away, but I do think especially that nighttime congestion was better, and his sleep therefore
Mm.
got a little bit better. But, feeding was more or less kind of a struggle and unpredictable. His schedule was unpredictable, and I was still getting clogs, like, 1 to 2 times a month, and I think I was in this cycle too where when he wouldn't feed well, I would hand express some to relieve some of the pressure, but maybe was hand expressing too much, and this wasn't helping the supply cycle. Um, and also difficult because I had gotten recommendations from various providers that, yeah, release some of the pressure, but I think maybe I was just doing it a little too much. And also, somebody had recommended use the Haka to relieve some of that engorgement. But I would like quickly fill up to 1 or 2 ounces on the Haka,
Mm.
and maybe that was too much. I was able to extend my return to work to 4 months, thankfully. And I was nervous to go back to work and also looking forward to just using a different part of my brain and just being out of the challenges that were occurring feeding at home
Mhm.
and see what happened when somebody else tried to feed him. Because during this time, we were trying so hard just to get our breastfeeding rhythm down that he hardly we didn't really do much with the bottle. I just didn't want to, even though I knew, "Oh, that might come back to bite me later." And he didn't take a bottle, but it was interesting because and it was dad who was mainly home with him. Many of the behaviors that he would do with me at the breast were happening when he was trying to take the bottle with my partner. And my mom helped out for a time too, and she had similar descriptions, and it felt really good and validating actually to me when she told me, "Gosh, like, he's a really tricky baby to feed. I see why it's been so challenging." Um, and
Sometimes people think, "Just feed the baby." Like, "Why are you putting so much energy into this?" But you can't sometimes just feed the baby.
yeah, yeah. And so he wasn't taking the bottle great when I was away, and then he could go many hours, like, up to 6 without taking the bottle, and when I
Wow.
got home, he was then quite ravenous and so hungry. I remember one
Mhm.
time he, like, latched onto my chin, and there was, again, more of this pressure, like, while I was at work to do my work and then pressure to get home to feed the baby, like, "Do not pass go, go feed
Mhm.
Milo right away." Um, and on top of this, like, there was many illnesses going around in the family, like, we got COVID the second week I returned to work.
Mm.
Although he fed very well that week, interestingly. I don't know if that's because my supply was tamped down a little bit. And
Yeah, that's
then
interesting to think about.
it was around 6 months, his reflux got dramatically better, just
Hmm.
so much less spit up. And feeding was getting better, and also, I just made a point that we need to get out of the house more. I was because he was so distractible and still so fussy, we didn't leave more because it was just so challenging. But I knew I needed to just be going out of the house more, had a trip I wanted to go on, like a local trip up from my sister's baby shower, and I got a cover, like this giant cover for him that worked so that he could focus on feeding. But the clogs, they continued, and around 7 months old, it was the peak of summer, and I got my, like, worst clog yet, and it was very interesting because it was hot, and also we had the morning I woke up with my breast seemingly, like, on fire and me on fire. There was also a fire burning on this nearby mountain,
Mm.
and this was my worst one yet, and I did need to be on antibiotics, and the lump in my breast, it was also alarming. It stuck around for a really long time, like almost 2 weeks, and I
Mm,
remember at that over the week mark,
mm,
I was starting to get concerned, "Why is this still here?" It did go away, but it was around then, that episode, that I just, it I don't know, but I realized, gosh, I gotta do something. Something's gotta change, and I think I just realized, wow, I think we've just got a real oversupply issue. And I sought maybe my third at that point opinion lactation consultant. And it wasn't my warmest and fuzziest one, but it was helpful to me in terms of confirming, yeah, I think your issue is oversupply and things could get better if you just work on that. So I had a new determination to do so, but I knew I needed a lot of support because I kind of felt in this body jail where I wanted to decrease the supply, but due to those earlier experiences, like early on when I was feeding him, I was worried that decreasing it would result in more plugs. And how could I make this cycle stop?
mhm,
But I was able to get some support, and I really gave the new mastitis recommendations a try, which include ice. And in the summer, also, that just felt good. And
mhm,
for me, ice was so helpful. In part, I think it
mhm,
helped decrease the inflammation, but also for me to just not hand express too much. It helped as like a stopgap measure.
mhm.
So a lot of the summer, there was a lot of my family got used to seeing kind of ice bags popping out of the corner of my shirt, and I was
Mhm.
eating sage like a bunny at a provider's recommendation. What was really, I think, helpful, though, was I reconnected with an acupuncturist who had been helpful to me at some other periods where I was maybe having trouble trusting my body, and I think it gave me a lot of confidence to be back in her care, and the clogs got a lot better. I also had a helpful consult with you that was really helpful as well, just as a long-term weaning plan. And so now he's 11 months old. He started sleeping through the night about a month ago, and initially I was really scared to let my breasts go the whole night, but I did, and they're okay, and I haven't been getting as many clogs. It's been quite a while.
Wow,
Yeah, and
that's amazing.
and I finally feel like I enjoy feeding him. Like, we actually have moments that are some smiling, and he actually seems satiated, and I can kind of
Mhm,
roll with the punches if he's not too into a feed and know that it's gonna be probably just fine.
mhm. Yeah, it can be so hard to try to reduce your supply. A, for the reasons you mentioned already, that it's a severe balancing act between how far can you go, how long can you go without removing milk, how much milk should you remove when you're just trying to get the pressure off. And those who have experienced continuous plug ducts and or mastitis, there's like this trauma response. Well, if I don't remove the milk, what if it happens again? And always just waiting for that other shoe to drop. And the other challenge I see people have, and I'm not sure, I didn't hear you experience this, but you can tell me how it played into your own experience. Often babies whose parents have oversupply, they do want to feed constantly and they're fussier. And then there's this doubt that gets planted. Maybe I don't have enough milk. And if I start to reduce my supply, the problem could get worse because it's hard to understand why oversupply would lead to a baby wanting to nurse all the
Yes.
time. So then you just think it must be that I don't have enough, and that's why they're constantly hungry.
Early on, this did occur, I think 4 to 6 weeks, where it was interesting. I had a couple days, my breasts were feeling softer, and I had also had one lactation consultant plant the seed too about, "Oh, maybe your supply actually is low and not high." And I
Mm.
yeah, had that concern for a little bit, but pretty I was able to it didn't get too stuck on that for long because it the milk just was going everywhere. There was just, like,
Hmm.
my bedside table was soaked in milk. Everything was just milk, just everywhere.
Mhm. Yeah, that's hard. And did anyone ever explain the mechanism by which a breastfed baby whose mom has oversupply, why they stay so fussy and are constantly wanting to eat? I can't remember if we discussed
I
this.
don't think so. I think it would be great to talk about.
What I understand about this is that there is a hormone that's called CKK, I believe. CCK, I'm sorry, cholecystokinin. And so what happens is it is the hormone m- that creates the feeling of satiation, and it gets triggered in the gut by fat. So people who have oversupply, as you mentioned, most of us don't need to worry about hind milk and foremilk. But what happens is the milk that comes at the beginning of the feed tends to be higher in lactose and lower in fat because the fat globules have stuck to the milk ducts. So if somebody has like a normal supply, or within the range of normal, and baby is actually able to empty the breast, then they're able to get to that fatty milk because it gets drawn out at the end of the feed. But if a person has oversupply, they get filled up on the high lactose milk. They don't drain the breast, but then that hormone doesn't get triggered by the higher fat content. And so then they constantly are hungry because they never get that feeling of satiation, even though they've had plenty of milk.
Mm.
So it really creates this cycle where the baby constantly wants to feed, so milk supply goes up, and then they never feel like they're getting enough. It's really, really hard. And because they are acting so hungry and wanting to nurse all the time, unless you do have milk just flowing out of your body all the time, it is hard to determine whether it's undersupply or oversupply
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And
Mm.
also, I ended up being quite responsive to the pump, so when I went back to work, I um, I was getting a lot of milk, and that wasn't helping either. It was wonderful that I was able to become a milk donor and donate, and I hope that has been helpful to other people. But I had to be conscientious also about the how pumping was tying into things too.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wanting to know if anything triggered the oversupply to begin with. Were you pumping it all in addition to feeding in the beginning, or it really just was how your body responded to the birth of your
It
baby?
was how my body responded, but also the beginning when he would only take one breast at night, I was so uncomfortable. I would use the Haakaa on the other one and get a lot.
Mhm.
I don't know if how much that contributed, but
Yeah, it could have exacerbated it, especially if you were prone to have an oversupply difficulty to begin with for whatever reason this time around.
yeah,
Yeah, he did have the tongue tie
he did.
release. Were you given any oral motor strength exercises to do by anybody in addition to having the release, before the release and after?
Before, yes. After, we were just instructed to do the stretches that our ENT recommended, which
Mm,
are also
mhm.
rather stressful to do.
They really are stressful. Yeah, and baby doesn't like them. Did you ever have thoughts of maybe breastfeeding isn't right for me and my baby, but then not know how to proceed if you decided to
do something different?
I had times where I thought, wow, this is really hard. This is a lot. Um, I considered it at moments, but I didn't, in my heart of hearts, I knew that for me to totally stop wasn't the grief in doing that was going to maybe be more than continuing on through what we were experiencing. And so that went into my consideration for going forward. But certainly what you had said before about even if I wanted to stop, it doesn't really feel like I could. In some of my
Mhm.
hardest times, that would pop up in my head. And so I wouldn't even go down the road of thinking about it anymore because I just
Mhm.
felt impossible.
Yeah, yeah. And as nursing clicked into place, that was around, did you say the 10-month mark,
Yeah, I
or
think
was
that
it
yes.
later? Okay, so as it started to feel easier, did bottle feeding also get easier at that time?
He did better with bottles, I would say around 6 months, he started doing better with bottles, and the other thing is he really enjoys solid food, so I think that
Mm.
also just helped with his demeanor during the daytime and when I was away.
I wanted to ask about what it was like having a baby that was so hard to nurse while also trying to tend to a toddler or a preschooler, because you mentioned there were times when you had to go up and be in an isolated room. Did you have your partner around to help during those times, or did you feel like you were needing to always constantly find ways to entertain your daughter so that you could feed the baby?
Yeah, no, I'm really grateful that my partner was oftentimes able to help with her because
Mm,
I think about that sometimes, and if it had just been me or if he had more of a demanding work schedule, I don't really know what we would have done. Maybe we would have done a lot of TV. Maybe I would have just had to deal with some of these issues earlier on. I'm not entirely sure. I also think that it was hard for her for me to be away and having
mm.
all of this kind of flurry around feeding her brother. So that was not ideal.
Yeah, I can imagine that would have been really hard for both of you. They're already older siblings are already experiencing so much. They most of the time love their little siblings, and it changes their life so much. And so then to have complications where mom is distracted or really not able to give as much energy as she really wants to makes it even more challenging.
Yeah. Although I kind of touched that she does talk about she knows, "Oh, you feed Milo from your body, from your breast," and even the other day, she was asking if she could feed him from her body, and so we had a little bit
Mhm.
of a talk about, breastfeeding, and if she wants to when she's older, she can feed babies.
Does she play with dolls?
Sometimes she does. She hasn't, interestingly, done, like, bringing the dolls to breastfeed them.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then are you still on the regiment are you still eating a lot of sage? Are you still going to acupuncture? Do you feel like you have to keep up with all of those things to ensure that your supply is manageable?
I have let the sage go. I am still going to acupuncture right now for support, but I don't feel like I need as much as I was a couple months ago. But I'll
Mhm.
probably keep going to acupuncture for probably as several months, maybe 1 to 2 times a month for a bit.
And now you feel it's manageable, your
I
supply.
do. And
Okay.
I also have we will go for as long as works for us. I also feel like I'm more open to adjusting things. I need to be so that neither of my mental health and his whatever his interests are addressed.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and you feel like that's more possible now.
Yeah,
You have a handle on how to slowly reduce your supply even more. Okay.
I know.
Yeah.
I was just gonna
Go
say, I
ahead.
know there's always curveballs, there can always be challenges, but I just feel more
Mhm.
confident.
And the fact that you haven't had a plug duct in a little while probably helps.
Oh, yeah. It's been wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. I so appreciate you sharing your story. This is one that so many people can relate to, whether it's oversupply or having a baby who just has a lot of difficulty at the breast or is distractible or trying to figure out the root cause, because you saw a lot of experts, you sought out a lot of people, and you were not always hearing the same exact messages from every single person. So then trying to find, what is the root cause and how do I get to it can be really challenging. And so just hearing a very educated person who is a medical professional herself say, I went through this and it was challenging, can be reassuring for so many people.
I hope so. I hope so. And I think sometimes there's multiple root causes. Maybe there was in
Right.
this situation.
Yeah, exactly. And because they're little humans that can't always tell us what's happening, it is harder to find out the difficulty when there are multiple things going on.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And if you have any resources you want to share, we can put those in the show notes. So I'll have anything that you felt like helped you, whether it's stuff that helped you with changing your diet or learning about allergies or oversupply, anything that you felt like was helpful to you as you tried to solve your root causes. If you'll share the links with me, I'll have them in the show
Okay.
notes.
Yeah, will do. Thank you so much, Lo.
Awesome. Yeah, this has been great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
It is so important for us to hear stories of people who do their research, who seek out the help of multiple people to help them solve their problems, and still struggle a little bit, because it helps us to feel less alone when we know that it's not just me. Rachel's story is such a great example of somebody who really persevered and got through, and in the end, despite the difficulty, has met her baby feeding goals. So whether you are suffering from oversupply or low milk supply, or a baby who wants to eat constantly and you don't know which it is, or if you are pregnant and would like to have a prenatal consultation to know how you can best feel prepared when you have your baby, reach out to me. I would love to do a consult with you, whether that's in person, if you live near me here in Massachusetts, or virtually. And if you or someone you know is pregnant and trying to prepare for the postpartum period, why not go to feastandfettle.com and see the meal options that are there. You can get $30 off with my code MILK, MILK.